can conduct our business without interruption and to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Thank you all for your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, pursuant to a ruling in accordance with the committee's routine motion concerning connection tests for witnesses. I am informing the committee that all witnesses have completed the required connection tests in advance of the meeting.
I want to make sure that you wait until you're recognized before speaking. And a reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. I don't want to see any cross-table comments. And I would also like to welcome our witnesses today. Our witnesses are here for the first hour. First, we have from the Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats, Jakub Kinsky, Deputy Director, COI Hybrid Influence. Welcome, sir. From the Media Ecosystem Observatory, Angus Bridgeman, who is an assistant professor. And as an individual, we have Mr. Kenny Chu here, who is a former member of Parliament. Thank you all for being here. Mr. Kinsky, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. I'd like you to go first. Please start.
Thank you very much, and let me thank you also for inviting me here. It is an honor both for me and for the Center of Excellence. In the limited time, allow me to address only two very brief points. What is the hybrid COE and what are we trying to do to help our participating states to counter the threat of disinformation? And secondly, what are the best practices in countering disinformation that we have identified? The Center of Excellence is an international organization for EU member states and NATO allied countries. So Canada is a member as well. And until recently, we had a seconded colleague from the Canadian government here. Currently, we have 35 participating states. So out of the group of EU NATO countries, we are missing only last one. Our mission is to strengthen the participating states' security by providing expertise and training for countering hybrid threats. In order to achieve these goals, we have different products, you could say. We publish reports, we organize events like conferences, seminars, workshops, and we run tailored products like trainings and exercises. We have these products also in the file of disinformation, which is my responsibility. Just recently, we published a report on the role of humor in countering disinformation. We published a report on the Ukrainian countermeasures against Russian disinformation, because Ukraine is the country that has the most experience with Russian disinformation. We published a report on the impact success of disinformation campaigns, because we saw that this is a topic that our participating states frequently struggle with. How can we estimate what is the impact, what is the effect of the work that the information aggressors are doing? We also run a workshop for practitioners in countering disinformation. So every year we gather the people from our participating states in Helsinki and have let them exchange best practices, lessons learned, what works, what doesn't work, what are the gaps, what more needs to be done. And we are also designing a brand new disinformation exercise where we would try and bring the knowledge to the capitals to do some capacity building there, train 30, 40, 50 people in a country on countering disinformation. If I move to the second topic, what are the best practices we have identified? Maybe let me kick off with an observation that I believe that it is necessary to implement many countermeasures simultaneously. Some people seem to think that one countermeasure will solve the whole problem. Some people think that about media literacy. Some people think that about strategic communication. I even registered people who are working just on mocking disinformers, that this is the only tool we need and nothing else is necessary. I don't believe it's true. I think we need to apply more countermeasures, because each of them will solve only a part of the problem. If we want to solve the whole problem, we need more countermeasures. The whole of society problems require whole of society solutions. So in the group of countermeasures, I believe we identified four bigger groups. I call it 4 lines of defense. So first, it's about detecting, documenting what is happening in the disinformation space. It sounds primitive, but unfortunately, we still don't have a full idea, especially about the quantitative aspect, like how many disinformation channels are there, how many messages per day they spread, how many people do they persuade. Imagine you would be fighting the COVID pandemic without knowing how many people got the virus, how many people are vaccinated, how many people died. It would be almost impossible. But unfortunately, we are in this situation with disinformation. It's very difficult to design adequate solutions when we don't have this data. The second line is about raising awareness. So whereas in the first line, we are trying to get more data, in the second line, we are trying to spread this information among more audiences. Here, I believe the number of actors is really key because each of them has only a very limited audience. The audiences are nowadays significantly more fragmented than they were 10, 15 years ago. And therefore, we need more actors who will be addressing the fragmented audiences that we have nowadays. The third line is about trying to repair the systemic weaknesses in the information ecosystem. So this is where media literacy comes in. This is where strategic communication comes in order to prevent the distrust of the population towards their institutions, which is a weakness that the disinformers are very often exploiting. But this is also where the pressure on social media companies come, because social media environment is unfortunately still a weakness that gets exploited by the information aggressors.
Okay, thank you.
And finally,
sorry, Mr. Kinsky, we're over time.
Okay, sorry about that.
If you want to pick up any of those points, you can do that during Q&A, but I'm going to go to Mr. Bridgeman now. Mr. Bridgeman, you have up to 5 minutes to address the committee. Go ahead, please. You're on mute.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, everyone. My name is Angus Bridgeman. I'm an assistant professor at McGill University, where I direct the Media Ecosystem Observatory. We're sort of Canada's leading research entity dedicated to understanding and addressing online harms. We also anchor the Canadian Digital Media Research Network. I want to focus kind of my comments on two thoughts today. The first is around this idea that mis and disinformation are an existential threat, and that they are the existential threat facing democracies today. And there's been some sort of recent international polling that has suggested that people are very profoundly concerned about this, and as parliamentarians, and of course the study in question, this is a real concern. And research over the last 5 years that my team and colleagues have done has really shown that mis and disinformation are part of the Canadian information ecosystem. They are part of it. They are there. And I'm really looking forward to hearing comments from the third speaker today about some of the impacts of it. But that this is not something that is changing the outcomes of elections. It is not something that is dramatically altering Canadians' attitudes and behaviors. There's a few reasons for that. First, most Canadians, most people are quite inattentive to politics. Individual stories, especially fringe misinformation and disinformation stories, kind of float by unheeded. Those who do hear them tend to be already predisposed to hearing that information, maybe already have attitudes in line with that misinformation. So what you're seeing there is this dynamic where, yes, it is occurring, but the actual systematic impact is relatively low. And we study that looking at sort of large-scale digital trace data coupled with nationally representative survey data. We did studies in the last two federal elections and the last Quebec election, and sort of for all three concluded that the role that misinformation played was relatively minor, although we did document numerous instances of it. And that sort of gets to the second point that I want to highlight, which is that there's this tendency to think of mis and disinformation from a harms perspective, from a securitization perspective. This is something we need to protect against, and there's value for that sort of thinking. But it's not the only way to think about it. And I think it's very important to sort of try to understand instead that mis and disinformation, false information, is a regular, consistent part of the information ecosystem, is a consistent part of politics, and its existence does not mean we need to stamp it out, we need to fight it, the mere fact that it exists does not mean that it is deserving of combating. Instead, we can think of, okay, this is an information ecosystem. This is something that can be studied. This is something that can be made more resilient. We can inform the population. We can do media literacy, of course, but there are other ways that we can sort of prepare a population to say, okay, this is the type of information you're going to encounter while you're using digital media, while you're trying to understand the political world. Here are some of the dynamics, and we can better understand those dynamics and better try to address them sort of collectively as a society. So sort of the first point there is that the mis and dis, it's out there. It's not that it's inconsequential. It does matter, but it is not existential, at least not yet in Canada, to the extent that there is this sort of pervasive feeling that, this is really deeply damaging. It matters. We need to study it. We need to address it. We need to think about it sort of in a holistic way, but we don't need to stamp it out. And the notion that even it could be stamped out or addressed in that way is sort of spurious. Happy to talk kind of about either of those points during the question answer period. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Bridgeman. Mr. Chu, 5 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, as we navigate through the labyrinth of disinformation and misinformation, I'm compelled to share personal experiences that underscore the urgency of our task. Whether concocted by state actors, malicious groups, or individuals, its intent is very clear. Manipulation it is. It seeks to sow discord, erode trust, and undermine the foundations of truth. In the crucible of Canada's electoral process, truth and deceptions collided, leaving lasting scars on our democracy. But what is disinformation? What is misinformation? Let me give an example on assault rifles and the campaign literature. Imagine on the quiet streets of Steveston, Richmond East during the last election, concerned and engaged Chinese residents would approach me and my dedicated volunteers. They would brandish a mail-in drop card, an innocuous piece of paper in their native Chinese language, advancing a dangerous falsehood. It asserted the Conservative government would revoke prohibition on assault rifles. This was chilling prospect, especially for many community members who hail from a culture with strict firearm prohibitions. But here's the twist. It was untrue. The Conservative had no such intention, yet misinformation, akin to stealthy intruder, permeated our community, sowing seeds of fear and mistrust. And let me tell you another cynical story. This time it's about disinformation. Like an architect crafting an elaborate facade, complete with fictional walls, doors, and windows, disinformation constructs an entire structure from scratch, intentionally to deceive its audience. Now, let me introduce my former opponent. In my view, his ascent to power was paved with disinformation, perhaps through a calculated strategy or at the very least, as a willing participant in a now proven disinformation campaign. He willingly embraced and propagated accusation targeting Conservatives, including our then leader Aaron O'Toole and myself, of racism and harboring anti-Asian sentiments, exploitative and manipulative. These allegations linked to foreign states reverberated through biased media channels and chat groups. If holding the Indian government accountable for alleged actions in Canada, it's not anti-Asian, anti-Indian, then why would countering the confirmed clandestine and deceptive efforts of Chinese communists in Canada ever be considered anti-Chinese? But there's more. He publicly pledged to the Chinese audience that he would not support a foreign influence registry. This promise directly contradicted the Minister of Public Safety's announcement in 2022 and 2023. As we gather here, I'm reminded of diabolical propaganda techniques employed by authoritarian regimes throughout history that involved repeating colossal falsehoods until they became accepted truth. Ordinary citizens bombarded with these orchestrated lies found their minds ensnared in a web of deception. Hatred and prejudice flourished as the strategy took root. Today, we face an even more vast digital battlefield where disinformation thrives. Our diaspora cultural communities, often isolated and insular, bear the brunt of these campaigns. Their reliance on ethnic media and foreign apps, while essential for maintaining connections, renders them vulnerable. Whether foreign regimes aim to meddle in our electoral process or domestic actors plot to mislead Canadians, the consequences are dire. To counter this manipulation, we must champion a vibrant and engaged ethnic media community, one that distinguishes facts from allegations, empowers informed debates, and refuses to be silenced. Let us heed the lessons of history, fortify our defenses with media literacy, and stand firm against corrosive forces that seek to manipulate our minds and fracture our unity. Thank you for your attention, and may our commitment to democracy in action guide us towards a future where the light of truth dispels the shadows of misinformation and disinformation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Thank you, everyone, for their opening statements. We're going to start with our first 6-minute rounds, and for that, we'll go to Mr. Cooper. You have 6 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chu, it is well documented that you were the subject of a disinformation campaign directed by the Beijing-based communist regime during the 2021 election, targeting the Chinese diaspora in your riding. Even though this government had information that you were being targeted, that information was not passed on to you, and voters in your riding were kept in the dark. Based on your experience, would you agree that the measures put in place by this Liberal government supposedly to counter foreign interference failed?
Well, thank you, through you, Mr. Chair, for the question. I think there has been many commentary on this, and I agree with some of the commentary that says, obviously, the Liberal government has set this up to catch Conservative being benefited by Russians' disinformation, and they are caught surprised by the Communist Chinese campaigning to help the Liberals themselves.
Beijing's disinformation campaign attacked your character and spread outright lies about your position and the position of the Conservative Party on a range of issues. Can you speak about that and what impact this disinformation campaign has had on your reputation in your community?
Thank you again for the question. I think there is a problem with your question, sir, because it presumed disinformation and misinformation, it's only spread during the election time. The matter of fact, it is not true. Even in the public inquiry into foreign interference, basically when the hearing were being conducted, there has been this disinformation. For example, MP Han Dong, when he testified, there had been articles written that says Mr. Han Dong was persecuted in Canada because of his mainland Chinese background. This is completely untrue, and we as Canadians know that, but many in the communities, because of parallel universe they live in, they don't.
Now, for you, Mr. Chair, not only did the mechanisms that the Liberal government set up to counter foreign interference completely fail to counter the disinformation campaign in your riding, but based upon what I'm hearing from your testimony, it's even worse than that insofar as I understand it. The Liberal Party took advantage of Beijing's disinformation narrative, amplified it, and even created complementary misinformation and disinformation products targeting the Chinese diaspora community in Steveston, Richmond East. Is that a fair characterization of what happened? Could you elaborate upon that?
That's my observation in the riding that I ran for re-election in Steveston, Richmond East in BC. Certainly, that's how I observed and felt. It seemed to me that I always put myself in my opponent's shoes. If I had observed this information being propagated against him, character assassination, I would actually stand to defend him because it is not true. It is not the right way to conduct our democracy. But unfortunately, that was not the case during the election in 2021. And it was obvious that there were targeted campaign, attack against me, and I was basically alone.
Well, very disturbing to learn that the Liberal Party actively amplified Beijing disinformation. They were not a mere bystander to it. It's worse than turning a blind eye, that's for sure. Now, for you, Mr. Chair, It came to light at the public inquiry on foreign interference that during the 2019 election, the Prime Minister's Department, the PCO, detected disinformation about Justin Trudeau in an article circulating on Facebook. The Prime Minister's Department asked Facebook to remove that article because they said it risked threatening the integrity of the election. By contrast, when the Prime Minister's Department was asked about the disinformation targeting you and the Conservative Party that was circulating on WeChat during the 2021 election, and why they didn't ask for that disinformation to be taken down, a representative from the Prime Minister's Department said dismissively, quote, "The content would likely only reach Chinese diaspora readers," end of quote. What do you make of that explanation, and what does it say about how this government operates?
It touches my very inner identity to its core, because I always believe that the Prime Minister is wrong, that Canada does not have a systemic and structural discrimination against certain group. But what I heard during the hearings shook that a little bit, because it looks like that there are some Canadians that are more worthy and valuable for protection than others. Canada is a multicultural society that we're in, and definitely every Canadian deserves to be protected. And it looks like that the mechanism that they put in place does not handle disinformation and misinformation being spread using non-official languages.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chu and Mr. Cooper. Mr. Housefather for 6, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Kinsky, my first question is to you. On October the 7th, Hamas terrorists attacked Israel, creating the biggest massacre of Jews since the Second World War and the Holocaust. Since then, there's been a great increase in anti-Semitism all across the world, including here in North America, where today college campuses are being occupied by people spreading anti-Semitic messaging. How has Russia been involved in fomenting that happening?
Thank you very much. Russia is always happy about any single opportunity where they can increase the polarization of the audiences. And obviously this conflict is one of the most polarizing topics. So they will be using it to do their work. The aim with which they are doing it is probably to spread more of the anti-Western, anti-American sentiment, the US still being the chief target of their disinformation campaigns, and probably with the logic that Israel is perceived as the biggest ally of the US. So I think the motivation is this primitive. In order to denigrate the US, they will be spreading a lot of anti-Israeli sentiments.
Are they joining with Iran in doing that? How is Iran involved in terms of Iran's sponsorship of terrorist organizations, Hamas and Hezbollah, and how are they working with Russia to spread disinformation on social media?
I have to admit, I do not have a good information on how they cooperate. So there have been some reports about Russia cooperating with China in the information space. I'm not aware of reports about the cooperation with Iran. However, I would not be surprised if it was happening. Russia is happy for any help they can get.
And when people can create divisions in North American societies, for example, by amplifying, as Russia does on social media, tropes such as that Jews control the world, or that Jews are more loyal to Israel than to their own countries, how does that help foment dissension and division in North America, creating an opportunity for Russia to divert the world's attention from the war that it's launched against Ukraine?
This will be definitely part of the reason why they're doing that. If more people focus on what's happening in the Middle East, less people will be focusing on what's happening in Ukraine. The way how they will try to increase the polarization will be to spread very extreme messaging. But sometimes they are doing it for both sides of the barricade. We saw the Russians organizing both pro-Muslim and anti-Muslim rally in the United States. We saw them spreading both radically feminist messaging and very anti-feminist messaging. We saw them spreading both aggressively pro-migration content and anti-migration content. the point is to portray the other side of barricade as unreasonable and something that you cannot agree with. So if you exaggerate the demands or the statements of the other side, then you decrease the possibility of reasonable discussion.
You've seen evidence of Russia amplifying and increasing its social media reach following the October 7th attack on Israel?
I'm not aware of any inauthentic campaigns in this regard, but it might just not be. I haven't paid enough attention.
So what I understood is that in the 7 weeks, so there's an article that you're quoted in Politico in Europe that an organization called the Alliance for Securing Democracy had compiled stats that Russian Facebook accounts posted 44,000 times in the 7 weeks after the conflict began, compared to 14,000 weeks in the 7 weeks before the conflict began, thus a tripling of their social media posts. And that this activity on Facebook was shared almost 400,000 times collectively, a fourfold increase compared to posts published before the conflict. So I've seen in a number of different studies on social media, and I think we'll have a witness, Mr. Chair, on Thursday, who will be talking to this, about how Russia is trying to ferment strife in North America, in Canada and the United States, turning us against each other to divert action or attention away from their own misdeeds in Ukraine. So I think I'm almost finished, so I'll just leave it with you if you have any last comments, Mr. Kinsky.
No, I agree with you. They will be doing that, but sometimes they are just following the news cycle. So when we had the COVID pandemic, they were focusing on COVID. Now, because media focus so much on what's happening in the Middle East, they use this, but it might be something different in a few weeks again.
Okay, you still have a minute, Mr. Housefather.
Okay.
Yeah. So
I didn't realize I had another minute.
I don't want.
Wow. Okay. So let me turn my attention, because Mr. Bridgeman hasn't gotten any questions yet. Mr. Bridgeman, do you have anything to say about what my questions on Russia and what Russia is doing to ferment disinformation in North America?
Yeah. Thank you for the opportunity. Just sort of very quickly, this is absolutely a phenomena. Russia, Iran, other entities do try to manipulate the information ecosystem in a country like Canada, and that is a phenomenon. We need to understand it, and we need to better study it. And some of the work I do is really about trying to sort of link entities from foreign countries and their penetration into the Canadian information ecosystem. And I can certainly talk about that more. But one of the things that is really key here that I really want to stress when we're talking about mis and disinformation, especially as it relates to sort of the work of parliamentarians, is a lot of this is domestic. It's not just the international that is driving polarization, that is driving toxicity, that is driving these things in our debate. They attempt to exacerbate. But as Mr. Kinsky was saying, they use opportunities afforded by our political environment, events, moments when there's tension in Canada or in the United States or in other countries where there is political tension, and they try to amplify that. And so there needs to be sort of a concerted effort collectively to say, oh, okay, here's a moment when they're trying to polarize us. We need to take a step back, and we're polarized on this issue. There's a problem here. We are going to have a heated debate.
That Mr. Bridgeman,
but it's not just because of them.
Yeah, sorry, sir, but that 1 minute grace turned into 1 minute overage. So, Madame Goudreau, bienvenue au comité. Vous avez 6 minutes.
Excellent, merci.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the witnesses, and I want to thank you. This is a very important study for our democracy. My comments will be really to gain a better understanding. From the start, we understand misinformation and disinformation both have impacts. We've had a picture of the situation, but really, where does this all originate? What are the causes for this? And I'd like to ask our two witnesses to answer those questions.
I'm going to start with Mr. Bridgeman. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, perfect. So, j'ai compris.
Yes.
Where does it come from? Okay, so in regular political discourse, there is.
Tu peux me parler en français.
You can speak to me in French. But for the benefit of everyone, I'll answer in English.
So,
Mais ma question,
But my question I'm asking it in French, and I would like an answer in French if possible, please.
Goudreau, si Monsieur...
Madame Goudreau, if Mr. Bridgeman is not in a position to answer in French, then he can answer in English, correct?
Answer, I've stopped the clock. J'ai arrêté le temps. Mais Mr. Bridgeman, I'd like you to answer in whatever language you feel comfortable in, sir. So go ahead.
Comme une marque de respect, je vais essayer de...
As a mark of respect, I'll try to answer in French. So yes, what are the sources of misinformation and disinformation in the context of politics? There's always a debate on facts. Always. The categories of misinformation and disinformation are not simply black and white. Sometimes it's quite clear, yes. Sometimes, as Mr. Chu described, it's very clear there is disinformation. But in most cases, with facts, there are debates, real debates, and it is the role of politicians, among others, to navigate through this, to listen, to speak to one another, to try to come to some truth, or to have a divergence of opinion, and then that's that. That's politics. There's always an ambient, as we say in English, a level of misinformation and disinformation within systems that exist. Sorry, I'll stop you on this. I don't have much time. I'd like to get back to the results of your poll. You said that the results of the election don't change, that the threats have always existed, but it's not existential. What's the result of all of this? What's the upshot? I'm not clear. When we look at the reports, I have a question. Do you know of this report, the Commonwealth Association's report, that mentions the significant impact on democracy that this is having? I'd like to hear what you have to say about this poll and my other questions. We did a poll in 2021, a representative population or segment of population, specifically Chinese Canadians, and what was the change in Canadians' opinions over the election? Had there been a very successful disinformation campaign that really changed information, the views, we would have seen that in the polls. There's not a major change. It doesn't mean it doesn't have an impact in one riding or an impact in some way. We've heard facts. We know that this has happened, but at the same time, it's not as though at the national population level there's been a change or we've seen one. It's important to say it exists, but the effects are more pernicious over the long term. What do you mean by long term? That's important. In this sense, the studies are showing at some point one of the major consequences of misinformation is actually that it reduces the confidence in politics, which is one of the most significant effects. And what we see in the last 5 years among Canadians, there's been a change in the confidence that we'll have in the media, journalists, and in the in politicians. Even 10 points in the last 10 years, which is partly the role of disinformation and misinformation. I'd like to ask, Mr. Chair, I'd like to ask our witness to provide the results of these polls and as well as the impact. There has been a change, and it would be important for the committee to have access to this information. I'd like us to discuss risks, and I've heard Mr. Kinsky's presentation on countermeasures, detection, raising awareness as to the number of actors because there are many, and also addressing the weaknesses. And I'd like to invite Mr. Kinsky to complete those 4 best practices, if you will.
Thank you very much. So before I talk about the 4th line, let me just briefly touch upon the first question you had. And sorry that I don't manage to reply in French. My French is horrible, despite having spent 3 years in Brussels.
Sir, you've got 45 seconds, so you're going to have to go quick, please.
Okay. So what is the cause? For Russia, this is a seemingly non-military measure to achieve military goals. They are very obvious about this. So for them, it's a measure to facilitate military operations. The annexation of Crimea, to which there was close to no reaction, is probably the biggest example of that. But we also see that they succeed in influencing our decision-making following the full-scale invasion in 2022. Russia is very open about the fact that their pseudo-journalists are part of rank and file of the military. They are receiving military awards for their work. Russia is openly telling us that. The fourth line that I did not mention is about limiting, punishing, and deterring of the information aggressors. So whereas in the first three lines, we are focusing on ourselves, on building up our defense, in the fourth line, we are actually trying to catch the aggressor here. So the first three lines are about building up our immunity and focusing on exercise and eating healthy. The fourth line is about trying to arrest the person who is shooting the people in the head.
Okay, merci, Monsieur Kinsky, aussi, Monsieur Bridgeman.
Thank you to our witnesses.
La demande.
Mr. Bridgeman, Madame Boudreau's requests for the poll results, can you share that with us? Will you be able to share that with the clerk of the committee up until Friday? That should give you, I think, enough time to do so? Yes, absolutely. We already have a study that's been published with that information, and we can also provide something that's a bit more specific to your question. Thank you very much, Mr. Bridgeman.
We're going to go to Mr. Green for 6 minutes. Go ahead, Mr. Green.
Thank you.
And I believe that you are on mute or your microphone is not working. Something's going on here.
I did.
Your microphone is not working.
Hello.
You want to? Yeah, we're not.
And
it's fading in and out, Mr. Green. Unfortunately, can you unplug?
Let me go.
Unplug and plug in again, if you don't mind.
I did just do a sound check. Hold on 1 second. Jabbera.
Yeah, you're on. We can hear you. So
How is it now?
Is it coming through the microphone? Is your microphone?
I can
plugged in?
hear it.
Okay. Yeah.
Can folks there hear me?
We're going to do a bit of a test. If you can count to 10, Mr. Green, that would be perfect, please. Yeah. Go ahead.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6,
Okay.
7, 8, 9, 10.
That's good. Thank you. Okay, we're going to start your time now, Mr. Green. Go ahead for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I have to say, I feel like I've been living in a bit of a parallel universe as Mr. Bridgeman states that perhaps he doesn't view this to be an existential threat. I wonder, Mr. Bridgeman, through your work, was there any study on the phenomenon that happened on the truckers' takeover of our capital, the shutdown of ports and bridges, and the civil unrest that was caused coming out of COVID, largely based on conspiracy theories of vaccines, misinformation, disinformation, both domestic and foreign. And I wondered if you could just speak to that. Did your studies take that into account? Because I have to say to you, later on this night, I'm going to be working on a group that is specifically dealing with the Emergency Act, sir. The Emergency Act being one of the most severe measures in our democracy, triggered by what I would say, after almost 2 years of reflection, by the high prevalence of misinformation and disinformation. So can you comment about the work that you're doing, and if you covered that local phenomenon, including many of the foreign actors that were involved in that campaign?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It'd be my pleasure. Yes, I fear that I've given the impression that I don't think that mis and disinformation is potentially existential. Instead, what I'm saying is today in Canada, from what we've observed in terms of impacts of instances of mis and disinformation, it hasn't risen to the level yet of election threat or sort of existential threat to democracy. You raised the trucker protests, and that's a great example of sort of, I think, a mix of two phenomena that are occurring. One of which is this mis and disinformation. And again, I'm happy to provide these to the committee, but have published several academic papers looking at mis and disinformation during COVID-19, and particularly the influence of a lot of the misinformation circulating in the United States and its profound impact on the digital ecosystem up here. So certainly, have observed that. It does matter. It is consequential. But there is also this other dimension of politics. And we can't confuse the two. We can't say just because something is there is mis and disinformation behind a political phenomena or part of a political phenomena, that political phenomena wouldn't exist without that mis and disinformation. That wouldn't have occurred absent that, and the solution to that that political movement is to stamp or reduce or remove or counter just the mis and disinformation part, because that's not necessarily true that we can just say, okay.
And if I could interject for a moment, while I appreciate the distinction between correlation and causation, I think it's safe to say that we wouldn't have ended up in a scenario that would have had to have resulted in invoking for the first time, second time in our history. One was the war measures. This was the Emergency Act in this iteration. A conspiracy that was based on clear misinformation around vaccines, tied to tropes around world control, the World Economic Forum, the World Health Organization. Indeed, we certainly have political actors, particularly in our conservative caucus, our friends who continue to espouse these types of conspiracies. But I would put to you, it's my assertion that the underlying pressure on that, had that topic not been perpetrated in that way, then the politicians at the end of the continuum wouldn't have had the material for the kind of ridiculous rhetoric that led in the shutting down of our country and ultimately the extreme measures that were taken vis-a-vis the Emergency Act. So going back to that, if logic says if there's no misinformation, disinformation material to hang their hat on, then malicious political actors on the other side wouldn't have the material to fan the kind of flames that end up in existential threats. And I say that because, while it is true there was a relatively peaceful de-escalation of that moment, it is also true that January 6th led to an insurrection in the United States of America. There are numerous examples around the world where rhetoric and disinformation is used to fuel genocidal rhetoric. We've heard about lots of different state actors here, and we'll get into more in further rounds. But I'm wondering, how do you reconcile that?
So maybe just two little quick things. I absolutely agree that mis and disinformation can exacerbate political anger in a huge way, and can really sort of generate these moments. January 6th, the truckers' protest. They can be strongly linked to sort of that mis and disinformation. Mis and disinformation is consequential, and in fact, one of the things that we sort of repeatedly show in our studies is that even if they don't reach sort of the broader population, you don't need to reach the whole population. You just need to reach a small enough active segment and a small, highly dedicated group of individuals who are have misperceptions or an enormous amount of political anger, partly born because of mis and disinformation, can have a huge political impact. So, well, let me
just interject for the last 30 seconds, because when I talk about an existential risk, it is clear that misinformation and disinformation are used to target minority communities. I'll give you an example. White nationalism, neo-Nazism in this country, the vilification of Muslims, of minorities, of trans folks results in the perpetrated violence that occurs. I would share to you the firebombing of Ibrahim Jami Mosque right here, people who are radicalized online by misinformation and disinformation campaigns. I would also put to you that the events that occurred around the truckers' convoy made it feel unsafe for parliamentarians to show up to work. Just a week ago, I had a rock thrown through my window. So the political climate that we're in with violence is an existential risk to our democratic institutions. Would you not agree?
Quickly.
The phenomena you've described, absolutely an existential risk. All I can say is that sort of in terms of linking directly to sort of election level outcomes, we've not seen that yet. It doesn't mean that mis and disinformation are not potentially deeply harming or are not deeply damaging to democracy in other ways.
You're going to start our second round for 5 minutes. Go ahead.
Thanks very much, Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here. Mr. Chu, the information you've provided this committee certainly shows an astounding double standard that existed between the way that the Prime Minister's office and what is not just the office of the Prime Minister, but the establishment of government and the massive resources that exist. in the context of whether that be directly with security establishment and intelligence apparatus, or the communications capacity of a government that is the size of the government of Canada. It shows an incredible double standard that existed between the way that they treated a the threat of disinformation targeting their political fortunes versus the political fortunes of their political opponents. Is that something that you'd agree with? And would you have any further comments on that double standard?
Thank you, Chair. Through you, I certainly get that impression myself as well. The Panel of Five and the Site Task Force, these are decision makers that aggregate and assess on aggregated information that is provided to them. So they are very far from where disinformation and misinformation happens locally. Canada has 338 ridings right now. There are many communities and ridings in that are relatively in isolation, perhaps. Stevenson Richmond East, for example, is in the city of Richmond that has more than 55% of ethnic Chinese, and then the rest of 45% are composed of also multiculturalistic communities as well. So there are ample opportunities for ambitious foreign actors to sway the result and change people's mind.
And if I could, and I'll, for the last 90 seconds or so, I'll pass it over to my colleague, Mr. Brock. But would you be willing to share, you said attacks on your integrity. Could you share with the committee some of those personal attacks, what you experienced, and hopefully if you can keep it in about 45 seconds, then I'll pass it over to my colleague.
Even until recently, when I testify when I was summoned at the commission hearing, there had been still disinformation being spread on CRTC regulated airwaves that says I am a liar, that says there has been zero proof for the Uyghur genocide that I advocated, that my proposed registry for foreign interference, it's entirely designed to persecute Chinese. So these attacks continue. I imagine they're concerned about me running again, and therefore harming their ability to propagate these attacks.
Thank you very much, and thanks for being honest with this committee, because I think that especially with somebody with your background, to face those attacks, I cannot imagine how that made you and your family, the challenges you faced as a result. But I'll pass it over to Mr. Brock.
1.5, Mr. Brock.
Thank you, Chair. Mr. Chu, your experience is extremely disturbing and alarming to parliamentarians and Canadians. I'm very sorry that you experienced the misinformation and disinformation campaign from the PRC, and that your own government failed you miserably. What I'm interested in, though, is more information with respect to the Liberal candidate who won the election. You talked about his amplification of the misinformation and disinformation. Can you give me more examples as to how he did that?
From what I've gathered, it's by attending radio interviews and also community events that he publicly announced that he is not going to support this anti-Asian foreign interference registry. There had been zero clarification as to the BLC 282 that I proposed. What exactly does it do? There has been no mentioning of any country whatsoever, and the fact that it's to inject transparency into political lobbying activities. These subtleties, these intricacies are not being clarified during those opportunities, and therefore by doing that, by not helping me to clarify my character, he perpetrated and continued the assassination attempts.
And did that continue the entire written process?
Yes.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher for 5, and then we've got 2.5, and then we're going to switch over to the second panel. Go ahead, Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks to all our panelists for being here. Mr. Kinsky, I'm very concerned about how disinformation goes from the dark recesses of the internet to the mainstream. So it starts with a lie, presumably on the internet, gets amplified by fake accounts, junk media outlets, becomes a hashtag, becomes a little bit more legitimate when ideological news outlets pick it up, and then eventually it lands in mainstream media or in a political party's platforms or speeches. Now, in 2019, when a Syrian family in Halifax died in a very tragic fire, the Prime Minister retweeted my condolence post. And all of a sudden, my social media blew up with racist conspiracy theories and hate about this family and this tragic occurrence. Clearly, bad actors and bots descended on this story, spreading hateful disinformation. And it makes me think about Alex Jones leading a campaign to, in America, to dismiss the slaughter of children at Sandy Hook School. He had claimed that it was staged and that grieving parents were actors. Memorial pages for the young children who were killed were inundated with vitriol towards the parents and mourners. Now, he recently said that he knew that what he was saying wasn't true. However, and this is shocking, in 2022, a poll in The Economist found that almost 20% of Americans believe that the mass shootings like the Sandy Hook massacre had been staged to support gun control. Mr. Kinsky, how does this happen? How does something like this how does a despicable lie from a garbage conspiracy theorist so fully entrench itself in the minds of mainstream citizens?
Thank you very much for the question, and I'm afraid I will have trouble fitting the answer in the limited time frame because this is a very complicated subject. It is I cannot tell you what is the level of coordination between Alex Jones and the very big disinformation players, by which I mean mainly Moscow. However, it seems very much like exactly the kind of work that Russia loves to be done everywhere in the world. Whenever there was a terrorist attack in Europe, be it Brussels, Paris, London, every time you would see the pro-Russian channel spreading exactly the same. It has been staged. It has been staged for the purpose of imposing greater control on the population. What Alex Jones was doing here was basically doing Russia's work. And I don't know whether he was doing it because he was paid for it. I don't know whether he was doing it because he's just a useful idiot abused by the Russian disinformers, but he was certainly doing that. The way these campaigns achieve such a magnificent result is mainly through the sheer numbers, because it's not just social media, it's also the traditional media, the Russian state-controlled ecosystem, the proxy ecosystem, like these Infowars and Breitbarts and Zero Hedges and similar outlets that are very often, they are always saying they are the only independent alternative to the mainstream, but they are usually parroting Russian disinformation. But also the local actors who are helping them to amplify this, be they paid agents, and there is a lot of evidence that Russia is paying hundreds of millions annually to cultivate these people to spread their disinformation campaigns, politicians, social media influencers, etc. But it might be also just ideological allies, it might be just useful idiots, and in certain cases it might be just cynical individuals who know that they are lying, but it helps them for their political purposes or other goals.
Mr. Chu, you heard the story about the Halifax family, the Syrian family that passed away. You heard me talk about the Alex Jones dismissing the slaughter of children in schools. Would you accept an endorsement from Alex Jones, or would you reject categorically that endorsement?
I'm not fully aware of what he said. And in fact, I don't pay much attention to Alex Jones myself. The only consideration I have is I was imagining what happened if those mis and disinformation are being spread on WeChat in a language that is not one of the official languages, and what kind of discourse we have, what kind of response are we going to have. Parliamentarian will not be even aware of the disinformation, misinformation being spread. And that's why I keep saying on WeChat, on TikTok, on Douyin. These are platforms that are problematic for us. These are controlled by foreign actors, and these are dictatorial regimes that are interested to harm the very peaceful harmony that Canada is in.
Thank you, Mr. Chu. Mr. Fisher, Madame Goudreau, 2 minutes et demie, s'il vous plaît.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Given the fact that I have 2.5 minutes, I have actually more requests than questions. I'd like to get to Mr. Bridgeman. You were talking about studies in the U.S. We'd like to have copies of those at the committee, and any further complementary information, whether it has to do with an effect on democratic life or anything of the nature. I am concerned by that. We want to find ways to counter what could be coming down the pike. Now, when you talk about reducing disinformation, for the benefit of the committee, I would like some information on that as well, so we can better do our jobs as legislators. I'll give Mr. Kinsky some time now. I understand, best practices when it comes to defense, if you will, and then the last part of repairing those gaps. If we don't have much time, I'd also urge our other witness to provide us any further information. I know that when in his opening statement he didn't have much time. I'll leave you the next minute to say what you can.
In case you would be interested in more detail, I will be more than happy to share with you one report on these 4 lines of defense. It's about 20 pages. In this repairing of the systemic weaknesses, I think we have the tools like media literacy. We see that in countries where they have a higher level of media literacy, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, there is a smaller problem with disinformation, not a zero problem, but a smaller one. Definitely strategic communication campaigns, the efforts to try and increase the level of trust of the audience into their institutions. It has to be depoliticized Stratcom. It cannot be a promotion of the current political leadership. But we see that in countries where there is a functioning strategic communication system, again, the trust of the audience is higher. But it's also trying to work on decreasing the polarization, decreasing the differences between the capital and the countryside, the people with higher income and lower income. Again, we see that in countries where there is a lower level of polarization, the problem with disinformation is smaller. So these would be the parts about repairing the weaknesses. But in case you are interested in more detail, I'll be more than happy to share the text.
Okay.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Let's go ahead.
Thank you. I just want to allow some more space for that so that we get solid recommendations coming out of the study, Mr. Kinsky. So I'll ask you with specificity, what legislative or regulatory measures in Europe or elsewhere have been successful in addressing disinformation campaigns, especially when it affects parliamentarians, whether during election periods or throughout the year?
I'm not really sure you would find legislative measures that are targeted only at disinformation campaigns, targeted elections. I think it would be more broad. I think it would be regardless of the election cycle. We saw the most aggressive measures like outright bans, most of them happening in Ukraine, but also in the EU. There was a ban on Russia Today and Sputnik. Ukraine has gone further. They banned also not owned by the state channels, but channels still spreading the same disinformation that is being spread by the channels owned by Russia, but channels owned by a Ukrainian oligarch, Viktor Medvedchuk. Most of Europe has not done that so far. But these outright bans, they would be probably the most aggressive solution.
On that point, though, let's be clear. Regardless of who owns it, particularly the private sector, you look at Meta, you look at X, if that information is for sale anyways, is it your assertion that we ban all platforms? I know in the United States, the Republicans and even I think some Democrats are pushing for the banning of TikTok, and yet you look at Cambridge Analytica and the lead up to January 6th, that insurrection certainly wasn't based on TikTok. So I wonder if you could comment just about whether or not the outright bans of these platforms is more theater than it is an actual application of a sound policy that wouldn't just see it migrate to other commercial interests like Meta or X.
We definitely see the information aggressors adapting to these measures and migrating to different platforms. But there has been some research, although unfortunately just anecdotal, that they always lose at least some of the audience. Not all of it, but at least some of it. And
just quickly before we end up, I want to go back to the parliamentarian thing. Would you care to comment? Do you think that there should be an opportunity for us to look at the way political parties use, like if we're talking about bans, do you think that we might want to look at legislation for partisan political parties